You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 159 of the Common Descent Podcast. Today we are discussing giraffes.
159 feels like a giraffe number to me.
Yeah.
For reasons I cannot explain.
Right?
Maybe just because I know that that's the number of this episode.
Yes.
That could be it. Giraffes are super cool and weird.
Yeah. They are so bizarre in basically every aspect.
From top to bottom.
Yep. So we're going to go over this bizarre group, talk about what makes a giraffe, and how do they achieve being as weird as they are.
Giraffeness.
Because it's not easy.
Yep.
Then we're going to talk a bit about the also bizarre fossil history.
Right. How did this happen?
Differently bizarre
Who did
than
this?
today's, but still.
I'm excited. This is a very charismatic, famous, and utterly unique in the world today group of animals.
Stands out from the rest.
Whose idea was this?
This was requested by a bunch of people.
People like giraffes.
We had requests from Jonathan, Big Boss Man, Diana, Alexander, MJ, The Load, Serpentine, Patrick, Kelly, Lydia, Luluchave, Eleanor, and Skypaver.
Thanks, everybody. You're all on the same page.
Yes. Giraffes are awesome. Everybody knows it. So we're going to talk about them this episode.
I can't wait.
But first, some quick announcements. Of course, the first of those announcements is that we have a Patreon. Our Patreon funds this podcast top to bottom. It allows us to do all the cool stuff and get the cool equipment. And when people sign up for our Patreon, they can get some extra doodads like extra audio, extra info about behind-the-scenes stuff, and getting to chat with us on a monthly basis. And they get their names shouted out at certain levels, like so. So we would like to welcome Jordy, Hannah, CU, Leo, Adriana, and Slam Jambert.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for your support. Hey, dear listener, if you'd like to support our science communication efforts, check the episode description for a link to our Patreon. We hope that you'll consider joining us.
You can also find links down there for our Zazzle store, for our social medias, to make donations, and to sign up for an Audible subscription with our link if you would like.
Oh, yeah, that supports us and also gets you books.
Yeah.
Also, the Discord link is down there.
Mm-hmm.
That's another place where people can interact with us on a monthly basis. All sorts of ways to get in touch with us.
Yes. One of the ways you can get in touch with us is we do have a physical address, which you'll also find. And we recently got a postcard from Elizabeth.
This postcard is full of X-Men stuff.
It was so X-Men-y.
And it's a Valentine's Day card.
Yeah.
That's officially what this is. It's sealed with a little heart.
Yep.
And it's full of X-Men stickers, which makes me very happy.
It was neat. It was very fun.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Like Will said, if you'd like to send us adorable, wonderful letters in the mail, check the episode description for our physical mailing address.
Absolutely. And that's all our announcements this time.
Great.
So
Forging ahead.
We can go right into the first official section, which is the news. Every episode, we like to gather some recent news from the last month or so of science, paleontology, Earth and evolutionary sciences, basically all those things that we're interested in here on the podcast to help us all keep up to date with what's going on. David, what's the news?
Well, this is a paleontology podcast, which means that we are contractually obligated to talk about dinosaurs on a regular basis.
Yes.
So, I got news about dinosaurs.
Woo.
Specifically, dinosaur feet and what they tell us about the lifestyles of the dinosaurs that had them.
Neat.
This is research by Michael Pittman et al. In the journal Nature Communications. And if you check the blog post, link in the episode description, you will find links to all of our news. This one, the link goes to an article in Science News by Derek Smith. The dinosaur feet that these authors are specifically looking at are those of early birds and near bird dinosaurs. So that whole selection of things that would have all looked basically like birds, but we're all sort of around the early stages of bird evolution.
Small feathery theropods.
As it turns out, in modern birds, there are all sorts of features on the feet that correlate with lifestyle.
Okay.
So the feet will have different shapes, different structures, different features, depending on if they're walking around on the ground, perching in trees, using their feet to catch prey or for other purposes. All those things can kind of be correlated with certain features in the feet. Now, oftentimes in the fossil record, we don't get a very good look at feet beyond the bones, but this study looked at a bunch of really well-preserved specimens from China. They examined 12 specimens from the Shandong Tianyu Museum in China, all of which are well-preserved specimens, mostly full skeletons, soft tissues preserved with feathers and skin outlines and all that sort of great stuff. They were able to do morphological analysis, which is a fancy word for just looking at the shape of it, and laser-stimulated fluorescence, which is a technique we've talked about before, which is a way to basically shoot lasers to illuminate features that might otherwise be invisible to us. They were able to examine the joints of the feet, so how the joints themselves were shaped, the shape of the claws at the end of the toes, and, in many of the specimens, the toe pads.
Whoa.
So the actual soft tissue. So this is the bird equivalent of toe beans.
Yes, exactly.
On a dog or a cat.
Mm-hmm.
These pads are what, I think this was somewhere in the paper, they described it as, these are the structure that the bird uses to interact directly with the environment.
Yeah, it's their palm of the foot.
Yes, which means that the shape of it often correlates to certain different lifestyles. Now, they looked at a whole bunch of different specimens of a bunch of different species and found that the paper actually goes through each one in detail. I'm just going to give us an overview and then point out the one that's making the headlines. So they found a wide diversity of things. So, for example, in certain ancient birds or near bird things like Ambopteryx, Anchiornis, and Archaeopteryx, certain features, including straighter claws, flatter toe pads, suggest less grasping ability, and probably a lifestyle that was more ground-dwelling than flapping around and perching or climbing as much.
Mm-hmm.
These were probably running around on the ground, based on what we see in modern-day birds. Also, this is consistent with previous suggestions that these are animals that weren't quite as good at flying.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, some of their fossils came out as perching. So Fortunguavis came out as a perching bird. Confucius ornis came out as a generalist flyer. And some, they specified, like Sapiornis and one particular specimen of Archaeopteryx, don't line up with any birds today.
Ooh.
They said that they have a bunch of different features that don't actually directly correlate with any particular bird, that at least that they studied in their analysis.
Yeah.
So they may have been doing something slightly different than we have a comparison for today.
Yeah.
But the one getting all the attention and the one that's in the headlines is Microraptor. We talked about Microraptor all the time on the podcast. This was a crow-sized, non-bird dinosaur, but it was winged. It had wings on both the front and the back legs, and is inferred to have been at least a glider, if not an actual powered flyer. This study found that the toe pads on Microraptor were protruding, so they stuck out from the foot a little bit, and had these little scales on the surface of them, which is something that we see in raptors today.
Ah.
A feature that the authors describe specifically is something that makes birds very good at grabbing prey out of the air.
Okay.
So some of the other fossils that they looked at, they interpreted as ground-dwelling hunters, that they could be using their feet to pin prey, like a lot of birds will do today.
Mm-hmm.
This specifically, they related it to things like hawks, which hunt in the air. They also pointed out that the shapes of the joints and the shapes of the claws looked a lot like modern raptors. And then they also point out, with another thing we've talked about previously on the podcast, that Microraptor, at least one specimen of Microraptor, has been found with bird remains in the stomach contents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the shape of toe pads is a cool indicator of lifestyle, certainly not conclusive, and there have been some other paleontologists who have been cited in some of these articles to say this is cool, but let's not, claim this is the end-all of the whole conversation.
Etch it in stone right away.
But it is very cool to note that Microraptor has, even to the details of the scales on the toe beans, feet very much like raptors today, aerial hunters today.
Well, and it's a very intriguing indicator that even if they weren't for sure doing that it seems likely they might have had the capability to do something similar or involving behavior like that. Like, so
Right.
they might have been doing a similar grasping, and, you know, even if they may not be plucking things out of the sky, but they might be doing something that involves similar skills,
Yeah.
which is very cool. And it's a neat way to examine their behavior. Like, it is very easy, I think, to overlook how simple part of the anatomies, like the bottom of your feet or you know, palms of your grasping appendages, are actually very important, because like I know fishing,
that's what you use to interact with the world.
like bald eagles and osprey, I know, have specialized toe pads for grasping onto slippery fish. Like,
Right.
they are very unique to fishing birds of prey. So, like, it makes sense, and it's very cool that we were able to study that.
Yes.
Wow. Oh, that's exciting.
On the whole, they noted that in addition to getting answers about some specific species, all the data taken together show us some interesting trends. For example, there is a diversity among these dozen different ancient dinosaurs, indicating a diverse ecological range of these early flying or nearly flying dinosaurs. They also pointed out that similarities with modern-day birds indicates that some of these early birds or non-bird dinosaurs were filling similar roles in their ecology to birds today. And they noted lots of specialization. Right, they did find some that seemed like more generalized lifestyles, you know, not hyper-specialized to doing any particular thing, but a lot of these seem to be very particular shapes linked with very particular lifestyles, and they point out that seeing lots of specialization is interesting both for an evolutionary perspective of how different groups were evolving for different lifestyles, but also that hyper-specialization makes species vulnerable to extinction.
Yes, it does.
And if we can get an idea, you know, with more research like this, of the diversity of lifestyles in different ancient birds, we might start to be able to put the pieces together to getting at the answers to questions like, why did certain birds survive mass extinction events while others didn't?
Yes, yes.
So there is a lot to potentially learn from the humble toe pad of a bunch of ancient birds.
Awesome. That's a cool one.
It's a pretty cool study.
Yeah.
And also, you know, we don't want to be sensationalist or anything, but the image of Microraptor gliding through the air and grabbing a bird out of the sky,
Oh, yeah.
whether or not that is actually what it was doing, is a very cool thing to think about.
It is a very cool image. It
makes me very happy.
I want to see it animated.
Put it in a documentary.
Yeah.
At least put it in a documentary and we'll see what it looks like.
Well, my first bit of news is about marine crocs, because there was news about crocs. And so, obligation states
So it's croc time.
we're going to talk about crocs. This is actually two pieces of research, both describing new species of marine crocs that are both toward the very oldest that we have fossils for marine crocs, and give us some data about the early history of this group. These pieces of research are by Eric Wilberg et al. In the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology, and the other is by Hickam Banani et al. In the Journal of African Earth Sciences. And the article we'll be linking to is by Carly Casella in Science Alert. So the Thylatosuchians are a group of ancient marine crocs. They were made up by the teleosaurids, which were the more croc-looking ones but lived out in the ocean, and then the Meteorrhynchids, which were like mosasaur shaped. They had flippers and fluked tails. They were extremely successful from the Jurassic through the Cretaceous, many of them having slender snouts. We talked a lot about them in the Crocs episode way back in episode 2.
Episode 2. Hey, you know that one.
I know that one. Their phylogenetic position among crocs and archosaurs is something that is under question and has been debated and shifted. They're either sister group to crocodiliforms, which is the large group, so they're outside of one.
Just outside of sort of the big crocs group themselves.
Exactly. Or they're at the base of the mesocrocodilians, which leads to more of the main group. Or they might be among the long-snouted Neosuchians, which is even closer.
Yeah.
So
somewhere along the line of crocs they branched off.
Exactly. We don't fully know where they fit into the overall croc family. The earliest definite fossils that have typically been known from this group date to the early Jurassic, around 180 to 170 million years old, and they already possess the features that we expect from this group, so they don't seem to show us how they evolved to become these marine crocs. They already seem to be marine. And up until recently, we were lacking older fossils, and estimates put the origins for this group at least by the early Jurassic, almost 200 million years ago. So like 200, 190.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have any fossils between those, so we have a gap. Right. That some ghost lineages.
Somewhere within there is the origins of these crocs.
And so they've suspected that lineage is waiting to be found. These fossils fill that gap in a bit.
Oh.
The first species, by Eric Wilberg et al., is Turnersuchus hingeliae, and at the time it was published, in January, it was the earliest Thalattosuchian currently known.
Cool. From
the early Jurassic, 185 million years ago. It is also one of the most complete of these crocs.
Oh, those don't always go together.
Yes.
The earliest and the most complete.
It is well preserved. It includes cranial, mandibular, so the jaw, the axial skeleton, and some of the limb elements.
Cool.
And is partially articulated. So it's very complete and still together in parts. Measured about 2 meters long, so this is a 6-ish foot croc, and still possessed the short limbs and long, strong tail, so it would have looked
like a croc.
Would have looked like a croc, but likely swimming out in salt water. Using this fossil, they did an analysis to figure out where it might group and maybe give us more information about the overall group. And it seems that it is one of the earliest diverging, would have been sister group to the teleosaurs or the metriorhynchids. So it would have been outside of those two main groups of the Thalattosuchians.
Gotcha. So therefore, potentially an indicator of what the ancestors of those groups would have looked like.
Precisely. This also suggested, based on their morphological comparisons, of a split of the Thalattosuchians from the rest of crocs around 200 million years ago. So a bit older than previous, roughly around that time.
Right at that Triassic-Jurassic boundary.
Yes, and they said probably toward the end of the Triassic is where the researchers were leaning, so that it might even be older than we had previously suspected with this new specimen, which would also put it around the same time that a lot of other ancient croc groups were appearing in the fossil record.
Late Triassic is when a lot of reptile groups were really finding their place.
Exactly. We don't have any fossils going back that far since this is the oldest one, but this has pushed back our time a bit as when we would suspect that, which would also indicate that they survived the in-Triassic mass extinction,
right?
Which is notable. The other fossil, which was found in Morocco, the first one was from the UK. This one is estimated to be even slightly older, but it was published this month in February, so it is now the
oldest. It has outdone that first study.
Yep.
Science moves fast sometimes.
It was very funny reading both abstracts. It's like, the oldest. And I was like, but you both said, okay, January, February, I get it. Yep. This is seemingly a teleosaurid croc of some, closer to that group at least. This is very earliest Jurassic, 201 to 190 million years ago.
So somewhere in that space.
Yep, right there at the very beginning of the Jurassic is the estimate. This came from a cave deposit in Morocco and consisted of a skull and nested mandibles, so still in the rock and not very well preserved. This one is much more fragile. They were not able to remove it. They did 3D modeling to be able to reconstruct it, and they even took a cast to preserve the fossil in its current condition because they didn't want to try to do more with it. And it was so badly preserved that they were not able to get it down to a genus teleosaurid of some sort, but very early. And it is one of the only examples of this group found outside of Europe.
Oh, interesting.
African fossils are very rare. There's only been a couple of groups found in a few countries in Africa. I think they said only about 3 species have been named from there. So this is by far the oldest known from Africa, and one of the oldest known for this group in general. And the fact that we have an early member outside of the typical area we'd expect them means that they were widely distributed early in their history, which both of these only reinforce that we have a ghost lineage that may even be further back if they were already dispersing that far by this time.
Right. And when we say ghost lineage, this is a term we use in paleontology to mean we understand from various evidence where they should have originated.
Yes.
And then we have fossils, but there is a gap, so we don't know what the line looked like between that last common ancestor and the first fossils that we have.
And it seems like there's still a significant gap based on these new fossils.
That this might push the origin even back a little bit further than we thought.
Even with these new oldest fossils, we still are missing quite a bit.
And finding an early example in a different continent is the kind of thing that starts to make you think, maybe we're looking in the wrong place for these earliest fossils. Did they start somewhere else?
Yes. And then become common where we now think of them.
Yes, which is an answer we can only get by finding more fossils.
Yep.
Very cool stuff. Hey, I've got news that is completely different. This actually has perhaps more in common with our main topic of our episode. So this episode, we're talking about giraffes, which are one of the largest and most unique and most charismatic land mammals in the world today. I've got news about elephants.
All right. Okay. No, that is a pretty good grouping. No.
Speaking of Africa, although this doesn't come from Africa, this is from Germany. Specifically, elephants that seem like they were eaten by Neanderthals.
Cool.
This is research by Sabine Godzinski-Windhauser et al. In Science Advances, and in the blog post you will find a link to an article in Smithsonian Magazine by Sarah Kuda. Neanderthals, our extinct close relatives, a sister species to our own Homo sapiens. We've talked about Neanderthals a bunch on the podcast, and how as time goes on we are learning more and more about the complexities and nuances of Neanderthal lifestyles. One of the things that we know quite well about Neanderthals is that they hunted a bunch of different animals. We know from the archaeological, paleoanthropological record that Neanderthals were hunting deer, horses, bovines, rhinos, bears, all sorts of stuff. Typically, we know that by finding marks on bones left by either hunting or butchering, when they are carving the meat off of the bone in order to eat it, a thing that also our species has done for a long, long time.
Yep.
This is research that describes an assemblage of straight-tusked elephants that appear to have been butchered by Neanderthals. These come from a lake deposit in Germany. This is the Neumark Nord site complex. It's about 125,000 years old. This region, this sort of complex of sites, has a lot of Neanderthal tools, butchered remains. It sounds like it's well documented that they were active in this area. This site has a lot of tools, flint tools associated with Neanderthals, and also a bunch of elephants. Specifically, this is Paleoloxodon antiquus, which is, as the paper repeated over and over and over again, the largest Pleistocene land mammal.
Yep.
These elephants were enormous, certainly over 10 tons, 12, 13 tons. There have even been estimates within this genus for higher than that. But we are definitely up in that 10 to 12, 13 ton range, which can be twice as big as some of the bigger elephants that we get today.
Which is always one of those weird, like, these were big for elephants.
For elephants. Like, would have dwarfed modern elephants, at least in weight.
Yes.
They probably were a similar height, but they were big.
Beefy.
They estimate that there are probably about 70 different elephants preserved in this area, with what they interpreted as extensive butchering marks. The deposit, they estimated, likely covers about 2,000 years of time. So this suggests a site where Neanderthals were returning over the generations to hunt and eat these big elephants. Now, before I go on to more of their results, it's always worth pointing out that exciting results are always going to be questioned, and results about the lifestyles of ancient humans are always going to be something that people are going to go back and forth about and debate and discuss. I did not find any articles with quotes from outside researchers, sort of with criticisms of this research. I'm sure they exist. That's just putting the little asterisk here that there's a lot of complexity to understanding the lifestyles of ancient cultures. So we can make really cool inferences, but always be prepared for another study to come out, several months from now that has slightly different interpretations.
Yes.
The authors point out a number of things that they're inferring that seem to be cool. For one, The elephant bones seem to have extensive marks that are being interpreted as butchering marks, marks from the tools on the bone, but very little in the way of scavenging.
Okay.
Which might mean that the Neanderthals were doing a really good job getting all the meat and stuff off the bones.
Yeah.
And not leaving much for other scavengers. Another thing they noticed is that the elephants here appear to be almost all adult males.
Okay.
Which is not what you'd expect if they were just randomly finding elephants or just scavenging whatever elephant they happened to come upon.
Yes.
That seems like they might have been targeting a certain age and demographic of these animals. Now, on the one hand, the adult males are going to be the biggest and strongest ones, so that seems like it's probably a bad idea. But if they were anything like modern elephants, everyone else is with a herd.
Yes.
Like the females and the young males are going to be with a herd. So the authors suggest that they could have been driving these elephants, these lone elephants, into pits or into mud where they could trap them and then probably relatively easily dispatch of them for food. Now, they're interpreting the fact that it's all adult males as that they were probably targeting that age group. I suppose that it's possible that since adult males are off wandering on their own, this may have just been a place where adult males happen to be dying a bunch.
Yeah, I did have that thought of, like, we do know that elephants will return to specific places throughout their life. Like, they're very long remembered with specific localities.
Right. And because adult males are out wandering by themselves, they're more likely to get into trouble without any friends to help them out.
Yeah. So it could
So here's
be...
us offering alternatives. The third thing that they point out is that this might be important information for understanding the size of Neanderthal groups. So apparently, it has long been suspected that Neanderthals lived mainly in roaming groups of 20 or 25 people, relatively small groups. But they pointed out the fact that these were such extensively butchered remains and that they would have produced a lot of food might be an indicator that Neanderthals were either traveling in larger groups or gathering in large groups for these particular hunts. And then they did a bunch of really cool calculations and estimates based on what we know about butchering elephants to estimate what it would have taken to butcher these big elephants, which is very fun. So they estimated that each of these carcasses would have produced around 4 tons of meat, and that based on what we know of modern elephants, if there was a group of 25 people working on it, they estimate it would have taken them 3 to 5 days to remove all the meat from the carcass.
That's awesome.
And then they said, how much could you feed with this meat? And they estimated that much meat could potentially be enough to feed 25 people, a small group, for 3 months, or 350 people for a week. So this was a lot of meat. Now, they are using this idea to say, well, if they were in large groups, it might make more sense that they were able to do that work, and then it was worth it to get all of that meat off the bone. Although they did point out that there's nearby evidence of charcoal fires, and they point out that they could have been drying the meat. That's something that early humans would have doing. Early humans are known to have done.
So that they could have preserved it for longer.
Right. But they also relate it to a known habit in certain human cultures of what they called meat bonanzas, where large groups of people will gather for at least a short time in one place to perhaps prepare the hunt or dig the pits or whatever, and then process the food and eat. And these could be important places for interacting, different groups meeting up and interacting with each other.
Yeah, it's like a festival, but for hunting.
Yes, we get together. This is when the elephants come by. So let's meet up a month ahead of time, dig a big pit, and then when we get an elephant, we can all feast together, and it's, we all get to meet up and trade and, mate with each other or whatever it is we want to do.
Yes.
During this
tell
big gathering.
Stories and...
Yes. So these could have been these sort of cultural events.
The comparison of it making more sense for a big group potentially because that much, it was 3 months for the 25, group of 25.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a lot of months. Like, drying meat is an option, but you also need to be, if you're not staying there carrying it.
Right.
And that's a lot of months to be eating the same meat with it being safe to eat by the end of those 3 months.
It might make more sense that you're staying in one place with a larger group
Yes.
to eat all that meat.
The comparison it made me think of was the old Oregon Trail game whenever they had the buffalo stampedes, and the game, it just became a shooter gallery at that point. But then the game would always be like, hey, good job, you killed 23 buffalo. That was like 17,000 pounds of meat.
Right.
You were able to carry 2,000 pounds of that meat away. And I was always like, oh,
yeah, I'm a monster.
that's horrible. Like both from a gaming perspective, I earned all that meat, and also from a conservationist perspective, that's so wasteful.
An important lesson about history and human relationships with nature.
But in this case, that's a lot of work to put in to not being able to use all that meat.
Right.
If you're not in a group big enough to utilize it.
So, once again, I'm sure there will be lots of discussion back and forth about the relevance of these varying results. I always want to caution, especially with ancient human stuff, because it's very easy to go, oh, wow, cool, we found evidence that Neanderthals lived in groups of 350 people and killed adult male elephants. Oh, we have indications that that was possible. This does seem to be evidence that Neanderthals were eating elephants, which even that barest of conclusions is a pretty cool thing to add to their repertoire.
Absolutely. Well, and the caution is like, we always caution about interpreting behavior because behavior is very complex. But human behavior is ridiculously flexible.
Yes.
Like that can change within the single lifetime of an individual.
And indeed, one of the things they made a point of in the paper is pointing out that something we're learning, in addition to the complexity of Neanderthal cultural practices, is the diversity of Neanderthal. That
Precisely.
There may have been groups of Neanderthals that were small group, roaming groups, whereas in other places they may have lived in larger groups. In some places they may have been fishing more, in some places they may have been hunting different things. Because, we see that in all sorts of human cultures.
Yeah, because, we've been different whenever we're in different places, because different things make sense in different places.
So we are on this journey of learning that, that old idea of Neanderthals as these primitive, savage peoples is probably not right. They were probably a lot like modern humans. But we're also potentially learning painting all Neanderthals with the same brush is probably also an incorrect thing to do. They probably had a variety of different lifestyles and habits.
Well, it's the same thing that people point out when we talk about medieval period. It's like, all right, well, but which country do you mean?
Yes.
Because medieval France and medieval Germany are not the same place and the same people.
Right.
You can't just say this group of humans was this way. No, that's not how it works.
Neanderthals worked the same way. So good for those Neanderthals getting those big elephants.
Yeah, no.
Sorry, elephants.
Yeah, no.
Good. Neanderthals got to eat.
Hooray and all. My final bit of news kind of connects to both of yours.
Great.
One little part connects to this last one, but the first part connects heavily because it is about bird eggs. So instead of topaz, we're talking about eggs now.
All right.
Eggs of large ground-dwelling birds.
Oh, and elephants were ground-dwelling. I see the connection.
We do have elephant birds mentioned. So
okay, there it is. There's the line. There's the lineup.
Our Venn diagram is solid. This is research by Sung Choi et al. In eLife, and the press release is from Eureka Alert. This study was looking at the paleognaths, which is the group of birds that is full of flightless running birds.
Right, that's where your ratites, like ostriches, emus, things like that are.
Absolutely. The one flying group is the tinamous, which were listed in the article as poorly flighted.
Oh, that's just mean.
Yep.
Here, this is a group of birds that can't fly, and then those birds that think they can.
Yes. This group is mostly flightless, and with the presence or lack of flight in birds, tends to have an effect on egg mass. These also includes things like the thickness of the eggshell, and so this group is also known very often for larger, heavier eggs.
Right, like ostriches.
Absolutely.
The biggest eggs we know of.
And even kiwis, where their eggs are almost as big as they are.
Yes. I guess I should say the largest modern eggs that we know of.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons they're wanting to look into it, is that these may be our best analogs for non-avian dinosaurs, for their eggs and how they might have been functioning or, structured or whatever we're wanting to learn about their evolution. This study is looking at the structure of their eggs, partially because the phylogeny for this group has recently been revised, so they're due to a genome-wide comparative analysis.
So we have an updated view of their relationships.
Precisely. So they were like, all right, well, with this new update, let's look at the eggs in a new way and apply it. They are revisiting the evolution of their eggs because the egg shells of this group have different structures. Like, molecularly, they are structured in a different way. And there's 3 main morphotypes. The Rhea style, which has wedge-like microstructures. Now, that's how it's described. I don't actually know what it means.
Wedge-like microstructures. You can picture
the
it in your head.
microstructure is wedge-like.
Absolutely.
There you go. The ostrich style.
Put in your requests now for an episode about wedge-like microstructure, and we'll talk about it in detail.
And then we'll be forced to learn what that means. The ostrich-like and tinamou style morphotypes are both prism-shaped in their microstructure.
Sure, the light goes in and a rainbow comes out.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
So those are the 3 groups with 2 different structure styles to the eggshell. They wanted to know, did these similar structures have common ancestors? Were they evolved independently? What is the story of these structures? They used X-ray crystallography to analyze this microstructure, and they looked at all the clades of paleognaths today, including some of the extinct taxa like elephant birds and 2 types of moa. Mm-hmm. They also looked at eggshells of some non-avian bird-like dinosaurs, as well as a few modern flighted birds, the neognaths, so just your normal birds, basically.
Rude.
Right? But
the other birds.
They said that this include things like pheasant, goshawk, woodpecker, quail, and the common murre, which I don't know what a murre is.
Sure, a murre. Put in your request now.
Yep.
So about common murres.
They looked at the microstructure of all these eggs to figure out where these structures fit into bird evolution, and they found that all the Rhea style all the Rhea style eggshells,
the wedge ones,
they appear homologous, so single origin, one group, and represent the ancestral state for the paleognath eggshell.
Oh, so that this whole group started out that way.
Yes, that seems to be the original shape for their eggshell structure and one origin for that shape. The ostrich and tinamou morphotypes seem to have evolved independently of each other.
Even though they're both prism
yes.
style, they evolved separately. Okay.
From this wedge-like shape, it seems very likely. They noted that one of the big things with the study is that this technique can be used in multiple other scenarios. A technique we can use to potentially better understand dinosaur eggs in general and look into those for their evolution with similar microstructure techniques. They also noted that this could be helpful in archaeology because these eggshells from this group are often found in human settlements because we overlapped with ancient paleognaths.
Where they would carve all the meat off the elephant bird.
Yep.
Got it.
And so being able to identify eggshell that's found at those sites where we were eating their eggs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Could be helpful for identification on both ends.
It's always nice to get a reminder that eggs evolve too. That's not a part of the body, but it is a thing that the body produces.
Yes.
And so how that is structured, how those form, also we can follow the evolution of those things. It's really these newses have been a fun. This and the feet that at the top, as you said with the feet, it's really cool to be able to look at toe pads or claw shape and apply that to lifestyle evolution or how different groups are related. And it's really so much of evolutionary study is picking a very specific thing and saying, all right, how does this change over time across the evolutionary history of this group? And what might that tell us? And you can do that with basically anything. Like you can do that with ribs, and you can do that with teeth, and you can do that with eggshells, and they all have the potential to tell us different things about the evolutionary history of a group.
Yeah, well, I like when new ones are added to the list, because then eventually you'll get those massive studies that go, all right, recently there's been a bunch of study on this group. We're going to take all 23 of those body parts that were studied separately.
Yes.
And we're going to put them into a computer and say, based off of this, for all of this group, how does it sort out?
What was this animal doing?
Yes. Or this group of animals that we have now bits of data for the overall group. So it's always exciting when a new layer gets added to how to analyze a group.
So to speak.
Yes. And with that, we can wrap up our news and move on to the main discussion of giraffes.
Everybody look up.
Yes. What's a giraffe?
I'd love to learn.
And how does one be a giraffe? After the break. Giraffes, as we've said, are one of the most charismatic animals on our planet.
Yeah. They are very iconic. They're so recognizable. And they're also super cool.
And for us humans, they have been for forever. I found a quote from Pliny the Elder.
Sure.
Who is one of our first recorded naturalists from 64 AD, describing giraffes and their most striking features of elongated legs and neck, distinctive coat markings, and a gentle, aloof disposition.
Aloof, that's a great... I think that it has been suggested that the questing beast is possibly a giraffe.
Yes.
And it's got, the body of a leopard and the head of a snake.
Yep.
And whatever else, and some people have been like, are you talking about a giraffe?
Because... Is that the only way you knew how to describe this bizarre creature?
Because several cultures, presumably over time, have had the incredible opportunity to be the first person in your culture to see a giraffe and go, what the? No one's going to believe this.
Yep. It's very notable how fascinated we have been with giraffes throughout history. Giraffes... To get down to the brass tacks, so to speak, is a group of artiodactyls.
Is this our first artiodactyls episode?
I mean, technically.
We did whales.
Yes, we did do whales.
So kind of technically we did whales. I don't know, we've done a bunch of perissodactyls. We did horses and rhinos.
I always forget that because we did horns.
And we did horn. We've talked about artiodactyls.
Like, at length, but...
So sorry to all the artiodactyl fans out there. We've really been slacking.
Yeah, so this is your group of hooved herbivores with the split hooves instead of the middle toe being the main...
Right, these are even-toed ungulates. So giraffe, deer, bovines, pigs, camels, basically all the hoofed things that aren't horses, rhinos, and tapirs.
Pretty much. Giraffes are artiodactyls. They are a ruminant, so they have the, quote-unquote multi-chamber, the rumination in the stomach where they rot the plant material so it can break down more easily. The main group of the ruminants is the pecora, which we talked a bunch about in the headgear because that's where you find horns and antlers and headgear.
Episode 140.
They are closest to pronghorns among that group as far as the data seems to show right now.
Sure. Pronghorns, which notably are on the other side of the world.
Yep. And also super weird.
Yep.
But we'll talk about them later if people want us to. There are two members of the Giraffes.
The Giraffidae. Their lineage today.
You have the giraffe in Africa, the one you think of, and the okapi. Also African, but not as numerous, widespread, or as famous
or charismatic.
We've only known about it for a little over 100 years. For the modern scientific understanding, they are also not as tall, and they don't have that patchwork coating that you typically think of with a giraffe. They have just more of a typical gazelle patterning of brown with some little stripes here and there. They look pretty normal for an African herbivore.
Yeah.
Then their cousin is the giraffe.
Giraffes.
Now, currently, typically, when you look up giraffes, there's one species, Giraffa camelopardalis. But this has shifted. Right now, the most common thing you'll see is one species with typically 9 subspecies, though I think there's been up to 11 suggested throughout the history of our studying them. There have been a number of recent genetic studies that have come out that have suggested to split those subspecies up into a number of species.
Right. We might better classify them as distinct species.
Absolutely. And typically, the most common number I found was 4 species.
Yes, that sounds familiar.
Yep. The northern giraffe, the southern giraffe, the reticulated giraffe, and the Maasai giraffe. These include varying amounts of those subspecies.
Right.
With the northern giraffe being the current species we recognize.
Right.
And those others making up some amount of the typically 9 subspecies.
So there is ongoing discussion about how best to categorize giraffes.
Absolutely. We are still studying it. It's still being debated. I've seen papers that noted that there have also been studies that suggested 3 species, and I think up to 7 species. So, like, that species number is also changing as we are investigating their genetics.
I'm glad you said the name reticulated giraffes, because I couldn't remember. I was trying to think of examples of specific groups of giraffes, and I was like, no, that's a python.
Yep.
That's not reticulated. It's not reticulated, right?
Yep.
Yeah, they are reticulated giraffes.
Yes, they are. There are
because they're really long.
Because they're really long.
That's what reticulated means. It's not. That's not what it means.
No. It's referring to the coat pattern.
Coat pattern.
Yep.
Yeah.
There are a number of things that make giraffes stand out from,
so to speak.
Yep. Just other animals, but definitely among herbivorous mammals. A number of these things include their coat pattern is very unique.
Yeah, nothing else quite has the giraffe coat pattern.
Like, we're so used to it, I feel like, that I didn't even think of it when I was looking up notes, but I saw people mention it, I finally went, yeah, you know what? No one else does have that dark blotches covering up, what seemed to be covering up a tan background.
Yeah, the background for the YouTube video for this episode is that coat pattern. And when I went to pick it out, I was like, no, this is unmistakable.
Yes.
Like, this is a giraffe coat pattern.
And they are very interesting from a research perspective. Each giraffe, very much like you'll hear with zebras, has a unique coat pattern that can be identifiable.
Like fingerprints.
Yes, that we can use that for research to identify individuals within a group of giraffes. It's also heritable. It is passed from mother to offspring. You can see patterns and figure out relations within a group. The 9 subspecies can also be identified by their distinctness in their coat patterns. There are certain trends that you'll see in each group's coat patterning. They've also noted it as a way to examine fitness with keeping up with who's having young and how many of those young are surviving. So it's been used as a way to figure out how well is this group doing and how well is this female's offspring doing.
Right.
Which is notable because the pattern, it seems, mainly is for camouflage for the young. Though there have been a number of things that found that it might be to help with, like, heat regulation.
I've seen those cool, like, infrared images of giraffes that show that the splotches are a different heat signature than the in between the splotches parts of the body.
It's I don't know all the thermomechanics, but basically some research has found, and this is not something that is for sure because it's not listed in the Wikipedia article, so it is not solid enough to be.
So someone's removing it when people try to add it to the Wikipedia article.
I think this is something that's probably
it's recent.
Debated,
It seems like it's very recent.
But there have been some studies that have found higher amounts or sizes of sweat glands in the blotches.
Oh, cool.
In the dark spots on the coat, and that there is notable blood flow to those areas. And so that this could be a window to disperse heat with sweat, so specialized for that. I also saw at least one study that mentioned this, and I don't know if this was just a suggestion or if they had found measurements that the branching pattern in between the blotches might be camouflage to mimic the branching of the trees that they are, the acacia trees.
Huh. Interesting.
That people have noted a similarity in the angles of the pattern.
Yeah.
But that's, once again, I only saw that mentioned like a couple times.
Right. So that might also be something.
Yes.
Man, not every ground-dwelling animal has camouflage for blending in with the branches of trees.
Right? And this is also something that I feel is very interesting about giraffes. There are a bunch of big questions that we still have about them that will come up throughout this episode.
Yeah.
That you wouldn't think we'd have.
Because they're giraffes.
For one of our favorite animals.
Yes. And they're not hard to find.
No! Like, you'd think we'd have answered all the questions, but we are still trying to understand these truly unique creatures, even just why they are colored the way they're colored.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that makes them stand out is their headgear. The little horny knobs on the back of their head.
Yeah, we talked about these a bit in episode 140.
Absolutely. These are called ossicones. Many ruminants have horns and antlers and headgear that they use for display in combat. Giraffes are no different, except that their headgear is unique among animals today. So ossicones are different from horns in the fact that they are not extensions of the skull. They develop from calcified cartilage that starts in the skin and fuses to the skull.
Right.
So it is a different structure than a horn, and they are typically covered with with skin and hair.
Right. Horns tend to be covered in a keratin sheath, like you think of a cow's horn.
Yes.
This is just skin and hair.
Absolutely.
Right on top of that bone. Like the skull.
Absolutely. So it is a unique structure among headgear for our ruminants today. The okapis is very similar, except that the tip of their ossicones breaks through the skin.
Oh, that's right.
The bone is exposed.
Bone comes out.
Like on the giraffe, the tip is typically hairless. It's just bare skin.
Little
and
bald tip.
Yep, and they said that the skin there will even shed, like slough off from time to time.
Huh.
But it's still covered. The okapis ossicones go out of the skin, and it sounds like we don't know for sure if that's that they are coming through the skin or if it's kind of an antler situation where it is a distinct barrier. There is a lip there, sort of, that distinguishes the exposed portion versus the skin portion.
You shouldn't have bones sticking out.
Right?
That's just the wrong thing to do. At this point, we should probably remind people that down in the episode description, there's a link to the blog post. Yes. Which will have pictures.
There's going to be so many pictures, everyone.
And if you want to Google, that is OKAPI.
Yes.
Okapi.
They noted that through bone reabsorption, the tip sometimes will be cast off and making the tip potentially dead material. Once again, kind of like antlers.
Kind of like an antler, yeah.
So it's something weird's going on there. I didn't find a definite example of why it's different.
Listen, if we think giraffes are weird and mysterious, the okapi is the giraffe's bizarre, shadowy cousin.
Absolutely. These ossicones do have multiple functions, but the main one is male-to-male combat.
Yeah, giraffes fight a bunch.
Oh, yeah. And they fight in a very giraffe way.
They sure do. If you've never seen video of giraffes fighting, look up video of giraffes fighting. You will not believe it.
I pulled aside a YouTube video for us to put in the blog post.
Excellent.
They will sidle up next to each other so that they are standing shoulder to shoulder. And then they will swing their neck in a wide arch.
Like a wrecking ball.
So that they then come up and hit the other giraffe in usually the chest or neck area with the back of their head with those backward facing ossicones.
Yes. Just that long neck swinging around to slam their little head into the other animal.
Absolutely. And
a maneuver you would think would be guaranteed to break your neck.
Yes, that looks more painful to the one attacking than the one getting hit.
It looks terrible. And it sounds terrible.
And it is. Males have absolutely died from this combat.
Oh, yeah.
This is a potentially fatal combat. And it is because these ossicones typically are known by the two on the back of the head. Mm-hmm. Males will get a third sort of ossicone in the middle. There will be a bump that will get ossified, a secondary bone growth on that lump, so they can have 3. But they can have up to 5. They can get them above the eyes.
Huh.
They can get them multiple spots on the skull. And so as they age, they are known to get more bony growths across their skull, making their head, as it was often described, more club-like.
Yep.
And way more.
Yeah, that's true. More bone.
Adding more weight to do more damage. So they just turn their faces into a mace and then smack their rivals with it. Females, notably, do not do this combat, typically. They have been seen doing it against males sometimes, but not with each other.
Sure.
And they don't get those secondary ossicones.
Gotcha, but they've got the main 2.
They got the main 2. So those are in both, which is also notable because that's not always the case with ruminants. Sometimes you get only horns in the males and nothing in the females.
Right.
We have ossicones in both, but the males get extra ossicones.
Extra ossicones for extra punching power.
Yep. They do also have other features, though. They are evidently highly vascularized with lots of blood vessels flowing through them and are very sensitive to temperature change. Huh. And there's been noted some connection to them activating sweat glands. Like, they might be thermometers.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right? Which is just okay.
Just a little weather station up on top of the head.
You got some temperature antennas on your head.
You've got 5 different ossicones, and one of them is the wind vane, and one of them's a barometer.
Yep. Absolutely. The okapi also has the ossicones, as we mentioned, and they will also do a similar neck combat. I didn't find any images or videos of it.
Darn.
But they will also fight with ossicones. Here, though, females do not have ossicones.
Interesting.
They will have bumps
Right.
swelling of the skull.
Not the full developed ossicones.
Yep. So there is some distinct differences between, it's not just a short giraffe. It is different. Also notably, just to mention it really quick, ossicones are unique only to the giraffids today, but there are other fossil groups that have had ossicones.
Yes, and we talked about a bunch of those in 140, I believe.
Absolutely. The Protoceridae. The Protocerids were a group of artiodactyls, so, related, but they had ossicone-like head structures that they developed the same way, it seems, as ossicones, which makes them ossicones, instead of horns, even though they've got very horn-looking structures on the back of their head, and then a slingshot-looking structure on their nose.
Yes.
That goes up and then branches into two prongs at the tip.
Right. That is for sensing oncoming storms.
Yes, exactly.
Would you call it wedge-shaped? We like to have fun.
That's what they meant.
That's what it is.
All right. I'm back. I'm caught up. But by far, the most notable feature of giraffes is their height.
They're so tall.
They're so tall. They are the tallest mammal alive today.
And it's not even close.
No, it is ridiculous. The fully grown giraffes can range from 4 to almost 6 meters. So we're talking 14 to almost 20 feet tall. Males are taller than females, so the largest giraffes are going to be the males. And they achieve this in an interesting way that is not seen really in most other groups, in that it's not just that they have long necks, but they have long legs too.
Yeah, giraffes' legs are extremely... Like a giraffe's torso is way high up off the ground.
Absolutely. And their torso is also short, so it's not a tall torso.
Yeah, it's not like a horse. It's relatively short. It's relatively narrow, and it slopes down. They don't have that like big round booty,
Yes,
like you might see in a horse or something.
And so this combination of long legs and long neck is not something we really see in any other groups today. Like there are long necks and there are long legs, but we don't see any that go nearly to this extent. Obviously,
even the sauropods, the dinosaurs that are famous for long necks, aren't giraffe shaped.
Nope, they don't have those long stilt legs.
Yeah, they have big elephant legs.
Yeah, so this combination is fairly unique. It is not wholly unique though. There are fossil groups, some fossil camels.
Ah, yes.
Got very giraffe, almost sized, but also shaped with long necks and long legs.
Yes, the things like Megatilopus.
Yes. So it is not wholly unique to this group alone, but today we don't really see it in any other extant mammals.
Right.
It also has the longest neck of any extant animal, with the largest males having necks that can get up to almost 2.5 meters.
That's an 8-foot neck.
Yeah, that's an 8-foot neck.
And notably, for those who like this kind of stuff, we've mentioned this before on the podcast, almost all living mammals have the same number of neck vertebrae.
Yes, they do.
We have 7 neck vertebrae, and whereas sauropod dinosaurs, or things like snakes, will often lengthen the parts of the body by adding vertebrae, giraffes just made the vertebrae bigger and longer.
Yes.
Which is also a thing that sauropods did. But giraffes are not one of the mammals that has added extra vertebrae. Sloths have, because sloths are utterly bizarre. Episode 24. Giraffes just made the necks bigger and longer.
Which is something notable, and that's one of the things that you'll often find studies looking at, is that different groups will achieve similar exaggerations of body parts, but with different techniques. That sauropods seem like a go-to to compare giraffes to, but really there's not a lot of similarities. Like, they've got long necks, but it's not the same kind of neck. The body's not the same. They also typically aren't thought to have held their necks like giraffes hold their necks almost vertically.
Right. Giraffes are straight up in the air. Also, sauropods tended to have very tiny, dinky heads.
Yes, and giraffes actually have big heads.
Yeah, like a giraffe, their body is big, so the head doesn't seem all that big. But that's a big, sturdy skull.
If you stand next to a giraffe head, they're big.
They are big. And that's, of course, because they have to use them as wrecking balls.
Yes.
And swing them and knock each other out.
It's also something that's notable about this group is there's not many long-necked, big-headed animals, period.
Yeah.
Like, just throughout Earth history, that's not a combination you typically see. So they are still very unique in many ways. They have their long legs, which also are slightly longer than the neck slot. At the shoulder, they can be 10 feet tall, 3 meters. Now, being this tall comes with some major, like, engineering challenges. You're now fighting physics to get that tall.
One of the first things I remember learning about giraffes as a kid was watching a nature documentary that had a whole segment about how giraffes drink.
Yep. We still don't fully understand what is happening to make sure they don't pass out when that happens.
Right.
Because to get this tall, there are some things that have to happen to the body. The three main systems of the body that have shown the most adaptations for the height is their cardiovascular system, their blood and heart, the musculoskeletal system, so
bones and muscles,
and their nervous system,
right,
all have had major shifts and adaptations and specializations to adapt. The okapi hasn't.
Right. Because it's just shaped like a gazelle.
Because it's just shaped like a gazelle. So it notably does not have these specializations, which is just notable that these are not giraffid features.
Right. These are giraffe features.
Giraffa. As far as the musculoskeletal system, obviously they have long bones. That's pretty straightforward. There are some things I found it interesting that their nuchal ligament, which is the ligament that runs down basically the back of your neck along the top of the neck vertebrae and connects to the top of your back to support and strengthen the neck, is notably thickened here.
Makes sense.
So they have a suspension cable running along the neck. They also have a very interesting nervous system. The famous thing that you'll see noted is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is the nerve that runs from the brain to the larynx. So it's going to be helping control the muscles of the larynx, the voice box. And in mammals, and in tetrapods in general, basically, it runs from the brain and then down the neck, around under the great vessels of the heart, and then up to the larynx.
Right. This is one of those famous examples of poor evolutionary engineering, because the nerve only has to go like a few inches from the brain stem to the larynx, but it takes this long circuitous route past the heart, because in fish, the precursors of the larynx were right next to the heart.
Yes.
And as tetrapods evolved necks, the larynx got kind of pulled up along the neck, and that nerve was already hooked around that heart structure.
That didn't move.
And just had to get longer and longer. So now you have this nerve that is several times longer than it has to be. It got caught down there, and now it's nice and long. So in us, it only has to be a couple inches, but it is, I don't know how long it is, but it's several inches long. It goes all the way back
We'll
up.
talk about how long it is. This is often referred to by people as unintelligent design.
Right.
Like an example of how we would have fixed that if we were designing it.
Yes.
The reason it still is this way, like you might be wondering, okay, but why hasn't it, evolved to be more efficient, is because developmentally, it develops before those arches that make up pharyngeal and aortic arches separate. So it develops, in embryos.
A more fish-shaped structure, and then it lengthens out.
And then we continue to develop into a tetrapod shape, and the nerve is like, whoa, 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 and gets stretched. Because it runs down to the heart, it runs basically the full length of the neck twice, and a little bit of change. It is typically, on average, twice the length of whatever the animal's neck is.
Okay.
So whatever length your neck is, times that by 2, that's roughly how long this nerve is in you.
Okay, so like a foot long, somewhere in that range.
Well, the tallest giraffes have almost 2.5 meter long necks.
As we discussed, and evolution is unintelligent.
Yeah, so their nerve can be 5 meters long almost.
It's awesome. They talked about this in one of my favorite documentary series, which is called Inside Nature's Giants. I don't know if it's available here in the U.S. anywhere, but if you're creative, you can find it on the internet.
Yes.
Such a cool,
it's so good.
Such a cool document. And there was an episode about giraffes, and they find that nerve.
Yes.
And they trace it all the way down to the heart and all the way back up to the larynx. It is nonsense.
Now, the research paper I was reading this in also did just make the mention of, if this is true for just tetrapods, keep that in mind for sauropods.
Yes, absolutely. And like Mamenchisaurus would have had like a 30-foot long laryngeal nerve.
But one of the most famous thing you'll hear talked about with what has allowed giraffes to be as tall as they are is their cardiovascular system.
Right. Pumping
blood up a almost 10-foot neck is a lot of work. That you're fighting gravity the whole way at that point. And so the more distance you put between the brain and the heart, the more blood pressure you're going to need in the arteries to maintain a livable pressure at your brain and not just pass out from too little blood. You also need adaptations to prevent blood pooling because of gravity fighting you.
Yes.
And just gathering blood in parts of the body because, yeah, you're stretching everything so far above the ground. And sure enough, studies have found extremely notable high blood pressure among giraffes. But, counterintuitively, not notably ridiculous hearts. Their heart, relative to their size, is about similar to what we'd expect from other mammals.
Interesting.
And doesn't seem to be putting out that much more or using up that much more energy. So they're maintaining that blood pressure, but not with this high octane heart.
Yeah, so adaptations, I guess, in the vessels themselves.
And so they're maintaining the blood pressure with a number of things. They are also having to resist that blood pressure.
Yes.
Because they're creating high blood pressure in the arteries. They need those arteries to not burst or distend or malfunction. They have found things like thickened walls in the arteries to make them stronger. This is very notable in the legs because gravity is going to want to pool the blood into those limbs. And so the leg arteries are often thick-walled and smaller so that there's less blood flowing in them, so there's less pressure to be able to build up, with sphincter-like structures at the knees and elbows to actually control blood flow and keep it from just rushing down to the feet. And a quick note on the long legs, I did find one study that noted that when they looked at the physics, the forces that they experience, these long legs do have a downside, which is that they're less efficient runners. They experience more forces and lower max speed than they would if they had shorter legs.
That makes sense.
Makes sense.
If you think of an animal like a horse as one of the top running animals in the world in terms of just being well adapted to it, and you look at a giraffe, that is not built for running the way that a horse does.
It'd be like trying to ask you to do a sprint on stilts.
Yes.
I tried looking up to see if what research there was about how they managed lowering their neck down to drink and avoiding that head rush of blood going down the neck, which is the big question because they're having to angle it downward and going from a up high position where you're maintaining high blood pressure to now a lowered position where that high blood pressure should, if we're just using a straw, rush all the blood down to the head and make you pass out every time you take a drink. So far, there's not a definite answer to how they're achieving that. One solution I found was very interesting, is that there's a siphon mechanism in the veins, where as the blood flows down the jugular vein, it acts like a straw to pull blood up through the carotid artery and reduce the work the heart has to be doing, so that it uses that gravity pull to move blood in a particular way.
Oh, interesting.
With the flow of the blood moving other blood. I don't fully understand the exact flows they're talking about because I don't know giraffe anatomy quite that well.
Submit your request now for blood pressure something.
But that was the only one I found that was potentially the what's happening with the blood flow there. They do offset it by splaying their legs, which is the other famous thing about when they take a drink. Right. Is they have to spread their legs up. Yeah. But one of the largest, the most looming questions we have is, why are they so tall?
What is the benefit? What is the adaptive significance of being tall? Why did natural selection do all of this? Like, why all this ridiculous engineering was selected for over evolutionary time? What was the benefit driving that?
Absolutely. And in fact, it has been at the center of many an evolutionary debate, not just like about how did this evolve, but how does evolution work?
Yes.
Because this is such an extreme example of evolution.
This is the classic Lamarck example, which I don't actually know if Lamarck used this example himself, but it has become associated with Lamarck.
With his view of how evolution works.
Lamarckism, or at least a version of Lamarckism, of the giraffe stretching its neck and getting longer and longer.
Yeah, the acquired traits that a giraffe stretches, its neck gets a little bit longer, and then it now passes that slightly longer neck onto its offspring.
Right. Episode 56 for more on that.
That was then, of course, rebutted by Darwin coming and saying, no, it's not happening to the individual, but a variation in the traits is being passed on because one is more successful.
Right. And giraffes are such an iconic example, an extreme thing that we get to go, all right, if we can explain that,
Yes.
then we've got something.
I did find another case where the giraffe was used to combat against Darwin's view of things, which was that in the past we did not have a good fossil record for giraffes.
Mm-hmm.
So it looked like in the Pleistocene sometime, giraffes just kind of showed up the way they are. So we don't have, as it was quoted by one person, there is little evidence of a 3/4 necked giraffe.
Right.
That we don't see a stepping stone on the way there with the gradual accumulation of traits as Darwin suggested.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people using giraffes as an argument for punctuated equilibrium of the giraffe is obviously an example where traits were gained extremely quickly because we don't have long-necked cousins, and then suddenly we have the longest neck. How else can you explain that? So the giraffe has come up in multiple how does evolution work discussions.
Yeah.
Now, nowadays we do have a much better understanding of the fossil record of giraffes, and we do have those intermediate necks.
Cool. I bet we'll hear more about that later in the episode.
Yes, we will. But as for why do they have these long necks, the classic answer, and what both Lamarck and Darwin initially suggested, was it's to reach the tops of the trees.
Right. You can reach leaves that no one else can reach.
The high browsing solution is what it's often called, or hypothesis, that by competing with other browsers around them, or to avoid competition, I guess, getting taller means you can reach up to leaves and foliage that you're not even having to fight with the gazelles or wildebeest now. You're all eating at different levels, so no one's fighting. It's niche partitioning. It's also suggested that this could be driven by times of hardship, that during droughts where there's less foliage and maybe the only remaining foliage is the dried leaves on the top of the tree.
Right.
The tallest giraffes make it through those bottlenecks when a lot of herbivores might be dying, and so the shorter giraffes don't make it, the taller giraffes do, so the necks get a little bit longer that generation.
Sure. Also, since the necks can move up and down, it means not only can you reach the tallest leaves, you can reach everything up to the tallest leaves.
Absolutely.
So you have more food available to you, potentially.
This is supported by a number of lines of evidence. One is that giraffes and elephants are the only African animals we see eating the savanna trees.
Yes, and elephants, notably, are also very tall.
Yes.
Like, if we didn't have giraffes, elephants would be really impressive for how tall they are.
Yep.
But elephants also have built-in grabbers
Yeah.
that they can use to reach wherever they want. Episode 66.
It also seems to be supported by the fact that okapis don't have long necks and live in a very different habitat. So giraffes live in the savanna habitats, wide open grassy landscapes with sparse spread out trees, acacia and others that are notable landmarks on the horizon because you're not in a forest, but there just are trees here and there. While okapi tend to live in more densely forested areas, which means foliage is easily accessible to them just all around. They're surrounded by it. And that in that dense forest, a long neck might actually be a hindrance.
Right.
You might be more awkward, like having those giant antlers we've talked about with some fossil deer in densely forested areas. But there are some things that bring into question if this fully makes sense. One is you noting that you can eat at multiple levels, but there's been groups of giraffe that have been known mostly eating at lower levels, seemingly not taking advantage of being able to eat up high. And if that's the case, if that is a fairly normal behavior, there's some groups that show eating on higher parts, but there's some that don't seem to take advantage. So it's not seeming to be advantageous to them currently for high browsing. That brings into question that is the driving evolutionary pressure. People have also noted that they are unnecessarily tall to be able to compete with the other herbivores.
Yeah, you don't need to be 20 feet tall to outcompete a gazelle.
One thing said, and I love this way to describe it, at half their height, they'd still be able to outreach all their competitors.
Yes.
So that doesn't seem to be an adequate enough answer for how tall they are.
Right. And this, as we've discussed before, especially for an example so extreme as this, we would expect there to be multiple driving pressures. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't surprise me that the feeding hypothesis doesn't quite necessarily cover all the bases.
I also like that one thing pointed out that some of their competitors negate this advantage, like elephants and rhinos who will knock over trees.
Yes.
So
that's true.
If your competition is making it not tall anymore, then you're not getting an advantage over them by being tall. This has led to the next most common solution, which is often called the necks for sex. That combat, that neck combat is what drove. It's a sexual selection feedback loop that drove for longer and longer and more powerful necks for males to be able to become more and more dominant against their competition. Now, this has a mixture of support and a questioning levied at it. It is definitely notable that male giraffes with bigger and longer necks do tend to win dominance competitions.
Makes sense.
So that does seem to be a selection pressure. Longer neck means they're more likely to get to mate with females and drive off rivals. It is also noted that females do seem to select males with longer necks more often.
So, as we've talked about a bunch of times before, sexual selection driving extreme traits, episode 63.
And we do have evidence in the fossil record of other neck combat and combat selected giraffe cousins. We talked about one in the news. I had to look it up. Episode 141, the dome-headed giraffe cousins.
Oh, right.
Which is the genus Discocaryx, and these were giraffeoids. So I couldn't find where they fit in, so I couldn't put them in the list of fossils we'll talk about later.
Right. They are giraffe-ish.
They are somehow within the overall giraffomorphs. These were a Chinese Miocene species that had like Pachycephalosaurus dome heads and strengthened necks that seemed like they were butting heads, which is potential evidence that in the giraffe group we have potentially multiple lines of evidence of groups selecting heavily for extreme neck morphology based on male-to-male combat.
Yeah, and you even said that okapis will also do this. The other living giraffeids.
But there are some gaps in this theory. The biggest one is that it doesn't explain why females have long necks.
Right.
That's the big hole in this one. Feeding would expect to have equally tall necks for both. Here we have an explanation for why males have long necks, but not for why females do. Like, they will neck fight against males, but typically they kick with their feet if they're trying to fight.
Right.
And studies have shown that there's really not a statistically notable difference in neck length to body size with male and females. Males will have longer necks, but males are typically bigger than females.
Right. But proportionately, they're very similar.
So support and studies that overturn this hypothesis kind of go back and forth. Like, if you look this up, you can find a study just every few years that goes on either side to seem to find some support and not find some support.
So neither of these is the home run answer.
Yes. It is. These are the two main ones that most people hold up as the most likely. Neither fully answers it. It's probably a combination.
Sure.
But there are some other ideas.
I can think of some.
Oh, yeah. A couple interesting ones. Thermoregulation.
Yes. That was one of the first ones that came to mind. That's a lot of surface area for absorbing or reducing heat.
Now, there's, once again, some support, and I've seen a number of things that are like, yes, but once you actually calculate it, not really.
Okay.
Like, it doesn't actually add up to a big enough that we'd expect that to be advantage enough to get that extreme.
Interesting.
Noting that a lot of times when we see increase in size for thermoregulation, it is horizontally, laterally, not height-wise.
Makes sense.
So it doesn't fit the trends when we've seen that example in other groups. But if those patches are for heat dispersal, that could be part of it. They do say that if the neck is being used to exude heat, we wouldn't expect it to be furred. We'd expect it to be like, bare skin for sweating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, you'd expect more adaptations for that. One thing did note that it does give them a narrower profile to the sun, that they can angle their body so that less of their body is taking on sunlight and maybe better sustained during the hot parts of the day while being a big mammal.
Yeah. It's a way to get big while still maintaining a large surface area to volume ratio and avoiding as much sunlight.
Yeah, having a smaller silhouette than an elephant can. So that one there's some data to there. I did find one mention that in the past it's been thought that the reason they have to have a long neck is because they have long legs. And they need a long neck to now be able to drink.
Oh, yes, I have. Yeah, I have heard that.
Though that same paper, that mention that's been mentioned was like, but if a short-necked giraffe with long legs needed to drink, they'd probably just kneel down.
Right.
just sit.
It'd be fine.
It's been suggested that feeding efficiency, which has been also been noted for things like sauropods,
Yes.
that if you have a long neck and theirs is a very flexible neck,
Mm-hmm.
you can stand in one spot and feed around. And so you can pick an ideal place to be safe or keep an eye on things, but still reach half the tree.
Yes, the evolutionary equivalent of arranging all your snacks around you within reach so you
Yes.
don't have to get off the chair.
Exactly.
And you can just reach and eat everything.
This is seemingly potentially supported by the fact that they also have very long tongues that
Yes,
are
they do.
prehensile.
I was
they can
wondering if
reach
those were
out.
going to come up. Yeah,
Yep.
Giraffes have super long, very dexterous tongues.
Absolutely. There'll be a picture in the blog that is of me feeding a giraffe that you'll get to see. That very long tongue.
Yeah, I got to feed a giraffe, and it's great.
And so that supports that they are focused on reaching food efficiently.
Sure.
And big heads with large mouths. They can take in a large amount of food. So standing in one spot, they can take in food efficiently and quickly and reach more food. So the long neck might be an efficiency angle more than just reaching specific food.
Mm-hmm.
But the final one I found that was one I hadn't thought of was vigilance.
That was the other one that I thought about.
That being up that high, you have a better point of view and a better vantage point to keep an eye on the horizon and surrounding environment.
It's hard to sneak up on a giraffe.
Yes. And so this would be great for keeping track of predators. Also, though, noting food sources that you can go, oh, yeah, no, there's a tree over there.
Yes.
We don't have to go searching.
There's a tree over there and no one else is there yet.
Yes. I've already found it. We can be most efficient to get to the next source of food.
Yep. Also finding each other.
Yes,
on
keeping
a
track of a
landscape.
group. You can spread out more as you forage as a group because you can all see each other. Well, it's like being the tall person at a crowd.
Yes. Well, and it's especially handy if you're a big animal to try to avoid competing with each other for food while also maintaining the safety of a group.
Yes.
And whereas elephants, as we've discussed, are really good at talking to each other over long distances, giraffes might be just very good at seeing each other over long distances.
They also know that this comes in handy for very specific scenarios, like females have to keep an eye out for rogue males because they will stay in small groups, but the males will often be solitary. And when they find a group, they don't have a set mating season. So they don't know whether the females might be ready to mate. So they'll often come up and check by typically tasting their urine because that's how they get what hormones are going on.
Sure.
But that's going to interrupt the female while she's feeding.
Right. She's trying to do stuff.
So if she can spot a male more quickly, she can avoid him and keep feeding and avoid the interruption. They also know that since males are solitary, this might give them the advantage for a taller male to spot a rival male first and be able to prepare for combat or initiate combat with an advantage.
I also wonder I don't know how much this is true. There are definitely examples in nature where you have one species that is the lookout and other species rely on them to, the giraffe might give a call to warn its fellow giraffes.
And all the other animals know, whoop, that's the giraffe alarm.
Yes. And I don't know if giraffes are noted to do that very much.
Not that I've found anything of. But
the giraffe spots a lion and goes, hey, everybody, there's a lion. And all the other animals have adapted to go, the giraffe just said the lion thing, we need to be on the lookout. That could also be a potential benefit in a symbiotic relationship.
Yes, absolutely. They noted that this also seems to potentially be supported by the fact that the okapi is not tall in an environment where, in a heavily forested situation, being tall would not give you an increased line of sight.
Yes, because it's full of trees.
Yes, so there wouldn't be helpful there. And in the giraffe's environment, it is. So we do have the fact that we don't see this in an environment where it wouldn't be good, and we do see it in one where it would. They also note that their eyesight is different. Okapis have poor eyesight and tend to rely on scent and hearing to sense the environment and look out for trouble. Giraffes have great eyesight and rely on it more than scent and hearing for vigilance. They did note that, though, being that tall makes it great for seeing the horizon, but potentially makes it hard to see your feet.
Yes.
But giraffes' vision is specialized for them to be able to focus on the ground at their feet and in the distance. Equally as well.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So they have specialized to at least take advantage of this height for vigilance.
Right.
This paper also noted that this is a good explanation for a lot of other long necks as well. Because like camels have long necks, but they aren't typically browsing super higher than, other competitors, and they aren't hitting each other with their faces.
Right.
So
they're using their chests to crush each other's skulls.
Yes, exactly.
Put in your request now for a camels episode.
And that like birds like ostriches
Yep.
are also using long necks to keep an eye out for so like this is a good answer for long necks in many cases. Potentially not sauropods though. Like once again,
Right.
The seemingly group we would want to compare them to doesn't really seem to fit since you're not typically putting it up periscope style.
Right. That episode we did, episode 101.
Yes.
You haven't mentioned the other hypothesis for long necks in giraffes, which is that it gives them a better height for their weather vanes on their heads to read the weather.
To get up closer to the stratosphere.
You get up higher, and then they can gauge the weather conditions at different heights.
They can come down and tell everyone the weather report.
How's the weather up there?
Yep.
You get that, absolutely.
So that was one of my favorite parts of going through the notes, is just that we are still confused as to even what is the full advantage of that long neck, because there's multiple answers that might be equally good.
Well, and realistically, we
Yes.
so often, at little kids and Aesop's fables, we have this tendency to go, what is the reason for the giraffe's long neck? And we want there to be an answer.
Yes.
But when it comes to evolution of traits, especially a feature of an animal that has required a complete engineering overhaul of the entire body, odds are that has been driven by a variety of different potential benefits.
Precisely.
There probably isn't one answer to that question.
Each of these was probably playing at least a bit of a role in getting this neck longer and longer and longer.
Right. And different pressures might have been important in different times, in different groups, in different habitats, ending up with what we have today.
Yes. And so let's talk about how we ended up with what we have today from the fossil record perspective of how do we see the history of this long neck show up. And we'll talk about that after the break. Now, as so often is the case when we were discussing a unusual large mammal today, they were not always this rare. They used to be much more common, much more diverse, and much more widespread.
And we're not just talking about before modern humans got to them.
Nope.
And reduced the range of modern giraffes to a piddly little vestige of what it once was.
Yeah.
Which is also true.
Yes.
Bad humans.
No, in the fossil record, the overall giraffe group that includes their cousins and ancient, almost giraffes, has included many, many different groups that take various shapes and sizes. So this is today a very much remnant of a large group and a very particular shape.
Yes, like elephants. We talked about this with elephants. We've talked about this with sloths, animals where we have a very narrow representation today of what used to be a very diverse group.
Now, much of this diversity was during the Miocene, so that's where most of our discussion will be happening. And they were spread out throughout the old world. So we had African, but we also had Eurasian lineages. Of course, their evolution starts with artiodactyls, and the earliest artiodactyls we see show up around the Middle Eocene. And one group in particular, the Glossidae, which appeared around 25 million years ago in Eurasia. This was one of the first highly successful artiodactyls and gave rise to the lineages that would lead to the main ruminant lines. So this is where the earliest ancestors that would lead to giraffes likely came from. One of these groups that has often been looked at as a potential ancestral group is the Paleomoricidae. This is likely a subfamily of the Glossidae. They also were Eurasian, later Miocene, mostly known from Spain and China. Their fossils where they're found.
It's a weird combo.
Yep, right?
Sure.
They also had very interesting headgear structures. They do seem to be ossicones, but they had two above the eyes that were just horn-shaped. That could be cylindrical or flattish in cross-section, so kind of compressed. But then on the back of the skull, they had a branched ossicone or two ossicones that come off the back of the skull.
So this would have looked... So this is early artiodactyls. So we're looking at things with that general body shape of deer, cow, gazelle, antelope. Just that sort of artiodactyl shape, but with a bunch of headgear.
Absolutely, yeah. And these are often compared to deer, and many on this list will often be compared to gazelles.
Sure.
So very expected body shape. Very often, though, with notable headgear in many of the ruminant groups, but this group, we do see those ossicones as a feature, but taking very different shapes. This makes them almost kind of the reverse of the protoceratids we talked about earlier, where the forked horn thing is on the back of the head.
The slingshot thing on the nose in that other group.
Yes.
In these, they've got it in the back. Yep.
Absolutely. They also noted that the males will sometimes have fangs, like musk deer.
Huh.
Which, just to add that weirdness
It's
to
always fun to point out a saber-toothed animal.
Yeah, just so you can
wherever we find them.
add that to your mental image. I also think they said the females seem to be hornless, without ossicones.
Oh, interesting.
Which is, there is noted examples of potential sexual dimorphism in a number of these groups. Certain interpretations of the family tree of ruminants put this as the group that gave rise to the pronghorns, the enteliocaprids, and giraffes.
Okay.
That this is the origin of those two groups, specifically two subfamilies of the overall giraffe group, the Climacoceratidae and the Canthomoricidae, both of which were widely diverse. The Climacoceratids contain a number of fairly famous giraffe cousins. This group was similar. It shared features that definitely connect them to giraffes, but is definitely not the lineage that leads to modern giraffes.
Gotcha.
So it is more closely related to its sister group, and so shows more similarity to them than any similarity it shows to modern giraffes, or even later giraffe ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
They were known for having antler-like ossicones that branched.
Yeah.
Climacocerus, which is one of the earliest members of this group, looks very much like a deer. I'm showing David a picture because these ossicones are bizarre.
Oh yeah, that's just antlers.
It's just antlers.
Just looks like antlers.
Yep. And this was, numerous species had branched antlers like this, or multiple antlers. Sometimes they'd have 4 antlers spread out in different...
But not true antlers.
No.
Ossicones.
They were ossicones.
Shaped like antlers. Weird. Once again, episode 140 for all the distinguishing characteristics.
Yes. Another group that is often discussed in giraffe evolution is Prolibitherium. At one time, these were thought to be part of the Paleomoricids.
Okay.
That they were categorized there, and I know that the opposite has happened, where when they thought they found a Paleomoricid in like Africa or something, and then realized, no, it's another
Prolibitherium.
Yep. These had big fan-shaped ossicones and 4-horned ones.
Whoa.
Very, very unusual headgear.
So it's broad, kind of like a moose antler.
Yes.
Is broad.
And very often these early grouped members of the overall giraffe evolutionary tree are compared to moose.
Interesting.
They're not long-necked, they're not long-legged, but they have these big head structures. A lot of them end up being heavier bodied.
Not quite like a deer, that bulky body of a moose.
This group gave rise to one that is very famous and often compared to that, though they were big, is the Civethiers.
Ah, yes, I've heard of Civethierium.
Yes. This is an Asian group from the early Miocene, and some were as big as elephants. These were big, bulky giraffe cousins. Short-legged, short-necked, so not elongated, but big, with large ornamental head crests, ossicones, that often were kind of branched like a moose antler.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of flattened and splayed.
That picture reminds me actually a little bit of Lambiosaurus. That sort of double part head crest.
Yes, absolutely. And these had varieties. There was also cousins of these groups. Brahmatherium is a famous one.
Yeah. So some of you out there may be noticing a trend.
Yes.
With Shivatherium and Brahmatherium. There's a name origins pattern here.
A lot of theriums.
I believe there's also a Vishnu-therium.
Oh, yes.
Among this group.
A lot of yeses. Brahmatherium has one of my favorite head crests.
Whoa, that's so weird.
4-pronged, almost ceremonial-looking head crest.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of the, Uintatheres, except it's not way down at the front of the snout.
Yes.
It's farther up on top of the head.
A lot of giraffomorph ossicones definitely seem to have a display aspect. They're very wide and ornate.
Yeah, all of this really makes modern giraffe ossicones seem positively underwhelming.
Mm-hmm. This group, the Brahmatheriums, were cousins of Civatherium, not quite as big, and often compared to a just heavily built okapi.
Interesting.
And many have pointed to okapi retaining the ancestral body shape. That okapi is more normal for the wider history of the giraffe fossil record.
Right. Which,
And-
of course,
yeah.
it's more normal than
Yes.
giraffes. Giraffes are bizarre.
It's the reasonable one. And so you'll often see a lot of artwork, and there'll be pictures in the blog post where they will color them like an okapi.
Right.
Because they were probably living more similar to an okapi, so they probably were using camouflage in more similar habitats and lifestyles.
Right. Certainly makes more sense than giving them the giraffe pattern, which, as far as we know, is unique to giraffes.
Yep.
Okapis have, like, stripes and
Yeah.
stuff that we see in a lot of
You see that on like oryxes and all sorts of...
Yeah, zebras have stripes kind of like that.
The other side, the sister group, the Canthomericidae, this is the line that is thought to lead us to modern giraffes.
Okay.
And so they still have a ton of variety, and a lot of them are very similar groups. You will see similar morphologies show up. A lot of gazelle-shaped ones. Canthomerix, being one of the earliest members of this group, is described as just being like a medium-sized gazelle, lightly built, slender-limbed, what you'd expect for a gazelle, though they did say probably not as agile.
Okay.
Not quite as acrobatic as we think of gazelles today. These were from Africa, somewhere around 20-ish, 17 million years old.
Early Miocene.
Early Miocene. These do have a couple of more giraffoid features. Their teeth are being a little more similar. Their one characteristic feature of giraffoids is bilobed canines, lower canines, which may have been used to like strip vegetation.
Yeah.
That is a characteristic feature that we start to see here along this line.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, me neither.
That's cool.
They also had unbranched, so we don't see that antler-like structure, but they do have two ossicones. But boy, are they weird. They are horizontal and flattened triangles coming off the skull. Like
whoa, weird.
big eyebrows.
Well, it's like you've got a pair of folded napkins.
Yes.
Laying flat coming off the side of the head.
Yes, and they also are positioned more over the eye, which is a lot of the earlier ossicones we see in these groups were further up on the head, not on the back, like we think of with today's giraffe.
Yeah,
They're-
so this is more like a triceratops horn.
Yes.
Up above the eye.
Yes.
Those look like they would have been great for shade.
Oh, yeah.
Keeping the sun out of your eyes.
They do note that it doesn't show any evidence of elongation yet.
Okay.
So it's just
It's not all stretched out
nope,
yet.
no stretching happening. There were a number of other species similar to this one that had also similar headgear going on and have been found in multiple places like Saudi Arabia and Greece, so this was a fairly well spread out group. Many consider this to be a solid placeholder for the base of the giraffe line. Potentially Canthomerix specifically, but this group is often pointed as this is where we are heading toward giraffes for sure.
Right. These weird gazelle-like creatures with this bizarre headgear.
But there is a fairly decent gap between them and when we find the first, that is for sure, we are getting close to giraffes now. Many of this group seem to go extinct around 15 to 14 million years ago. The next group that likely evolved from the Canthomericids is the Paleotragonids. These arose around mid-Miocene in Africa, Arabia area, and is once again a step closer to modern giraffes. These include some we're starting to get very, at least okapi-shaped members here. We do start to see some lengthening of the neck, and in the fossil record, they notice an interesting pattern of how the neck lengthened. The vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae of the neck, closer to the skull, elongated earlier. So in the earlier groups, we see elongation there first, and then in later groups, we see the lower vertebrae of the neck elongate.
So the whole neck didn't get longer all at the same time. Certain vertebrae got longer, starting closer to the head. Oh, that's really interesting.
So we start to see that early elongation happening in this group. Not uniformly. There are a number of Eurasian groups that don't show much giraffe-like morphology, but a number of the African groups do seem to show starting to lean that way. A few of the famous of this group, Giraffes, often one of the more primitive, considered one of the more primitive of this group, and potentially intermediate between the Canthu-Mericids and this group. This was an Indian group about 15 to 12 million years ago, as well as other parts of Eurasia, and is also pegged potentially as one of the ancestral, genuses leading us to giraffes, and is often just shown as a very okapi-like. The only difference being they had 4 ossicones.
Interesting.
Like,
yeah.
They seem to basically be okapi,
Yeah.
just with slightly different headgear. And many have claimed that okapi might be almost a direct line from this overall group. That okapi might just be a lingering lineage from this group.
Interesting.
We do get Paleotragus, where our group name comes from, starting to show some more elongation. They also only typically have 2 ossicones, but they are much more horn-like. These are longer, taller ossicones.
Oh, gotcha. Now it looks like a gazelle or an antelope.
And still situated more over the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
We also see that the skull is starting to get more elongated and broadened, which is something that we see as a characteristic giraffe feature.
Yeah, that big giraffe head.
There were still a number of morphotypes here. Paleotragus primatus is one of the earliest for this particular group, and many consider it to be very similar to Giraffes, maybe the same, that it might have just be a direct line. This is just a later evolutionary line of that same group, or it might have moved in to fill the same niche. But they are very, very, very similar. But then you have others that were notably larger. Paleotragus germani was a larger species and more closely resembled giraffe with a longer neck and limbs.
Oh, interesting.
So we do we're
starting to get this diversity.
Yeah.
Not only different shapes, but also potentially similar shapes in different lineages.
Yes.
Doing similar things, and then diversity in their body shape doing different things.
Yes, so we're starting to see some okapi shapes. We're starting to see some giraffe shapes.
Okay.
Probably the most famous, though, of these groups is the Samotheres. These are often discussed in giraffe evolution because they are where we see what many point to as an intermediate giraffe neck.
Ah, okay. This is the halfway point.
This is the halfway point. They show some elongation. Now, these were often bigger. So these were large-bodied and longer-faced. They still have horns that are further up on the head, but they also show a skull with more pneumatic cavities.
More open spaces.
Yes.
Which we see in a lot of animals with big heads.
Yes.
These open spaces that, in part, help to reduce weight.
And giraffes have them in spades. It is a very characteristic feature of today's giraffes.
We see that in a lot of big dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
You also see it in elephants. The structure, I know this from the mastodon at the Gray Fossil Site.
Yes.
The structure of the bone has all these various sinus cavities, these holes structured throughout it.
They also are showing more giraffe-like teeth. They're getting those more hypsodont, taller teeth, whilst a lot of those other groups have much shorter teeth, not quite shaped like giraffes have them. Samotheres also are in the right place phylogenetically to be the next step toward giraffes.
Okay.
Age-wise, many of those Paleotragus species go extinct around 9 to 10 million years ago, and a lot of Samotheres show up around 9 to 5 million years ago.
All right, so the later part of the Miocene.
Mm-hmm. So it is potential that we have a ancestral state for Paleotragus and Samotheres arising from them.
Sure.
We do still have variation here with Eurasian Samotheres not looking a lot like giraffes, and some African Samotheres looking more like giraffes. And they are showing elongation in that front portion of the neck, but not yet the back portion.
Okay.
So this is where we're seeing kind of like not fully the finalization. It's not half a giraffe neck literally.
Right.
But we are elongated notably to a long neck, the front vertebrae, and the back has not yet started to follow that same trend, at least as much.
Right.
And so these look just kind of like bigger, bulkier giraffes.
Yeah.
And there were different size species, so there were some that were smaller, some that were larger, but kind of just a stout giraffe.
Shorter, bulkier, not quite. The analogy that first came to mind was actually that one we were in some episode. I think we talked about this in the pterosaurs episode 79. That there were a few different groups of super giant Ashdarchid pterosaurs,
Yes.
the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic, which are often compared to giraffes in their height and shape. And then there was that one, I think it was Amborgiania, that was a little shorter and stockier and bulkier than the other ones. That's kind of what that makes me think of.
Yeah.
That's a very weird analogy because I have to... It's a bad analogy because I have to explain what the other thing is.
Yes. But I get what you mean.
Go listen to episode 79. Oh, no, I think it was Hatzegopteryx. That's what I'm thinking.
Oh, yes.
It was Hatzegopteryx, which was the sort of bulky... This is a wild tangent. Go back to the giraffes.
There are cousins to the Samotheres that are not likely leading to giraffes, so that we were still having branching, we still had diversity.
The extended family.
Mm-hmm. Chanthitherium is a group that was closely related to Samotherium, known from China, and were more moose-like and antelope-like, with often 4 ossicones, not quite with the branching of those earlier groups we mentioned, but still with more texture and patterning and variety.
Oh, okay, yeah. It's interesting that the road to giraffes, as it were, is sort of filled with things that are like gazelle, antelope, deer, moose, basically all the variety of your kind of standard artiodactyls.
Yes.
On the way to eventually giving rise to the nonsense that is giraffes themselves.
Yep. And speaking of that nonsense, we're finally getting to some fairly giraffe-shaped giraffes.
Okay.
Bolinia is the genus that first appeared in Europe about 9 to 7 million years ago, likely from Samotherium africanum, and very closely resembles today's giraffes. It has long neck, long legs, similar dual ossicones toward the back of the head a bit more, similar teeth. It is a very giraffe-shaped giraffe.
Oh yeah, that reconstruction looks like a giraffe.
Yes, a little bit smaller. They weren't quite as big as today's giraffes, and definitely slightly different shape to the ossicones here and there. But by this point, we have elongated giraffe-shaped cousins.
And this is in Europe.
This is in Europe.
This one you pointed
Yep.
out. Mm-hmm.
This is the group that is suspected to have given rise to Giraffa.
True giraffes.
True giraffes, which spread out into both Eurasia and eventually Africa.
Right.
But tall, lanky giraffes was first diversified in Eurasia. This happened during the late Miocene and into the early Pliocene. There was at least 5 different Asian giraffe species, most of them very similar to today's giraffes. One, Giraffa punjabiensis, which is one of the oldest known and, as I said, unmistakable giraffa. Right,
the same genus as modern giraffes.
Definitely. This is right around 7 million years ago, Middle Pliocene, and is likely the one that gave rise to later Asian species, but it was still a bit smaller than the later African species. So we're still not quite as big as today's giraffes, but we are shaped that way and we are diversifying. Giraffa civilensis, though, is one of the later Asian species. This is a early Pleistocene, potentially, and closely resembles today's species, but was a little bit bigger.
Whoa.
This was a bigger giraffe.
I was wondering,
Yep.
and I know everyone was wondering.
Yes.
Because this is such a trope in paleontology that almost every living lineage of animals has a bigger cousin from the past. And I did not know if that was true for giraffes.
Yes, there are a couple that seem like they were particularly large giraffe species. Though still a little bit different here. They noted that its teeth were larger than Pujabensis, so getting bigger, but still not as big as the teeth we see in today's giraffe. So it still had notable features and notable dentition. Honanotherium was another large Chinese species. So we had this early radiation in Indo-Asia mostly. Then, as they move more southwestwardly, eventually we get the first migration into Africa and the diversification into Africa with at least 5 species that now we only have the one, potentially...
One question mark.
Yes, but the 4 that we've questioned today are not any of these.
Right.
These were 5 initial radiations, one of which is our northern giraffe that we have.
So giraffe, as an animal as we think of it, is really a feature of the last 9 or 10 million years on Earth, but African giraffes are a relatively recent thing.
Yes.
That it's always tricky because some animals are, like elephants, if I remember correctly, are thought to have potentially gotten their start in Africa, where they are still diverse today, even though they spread around the world. Whereas we talked about rhinos. Rhinos got their start in North America, where they're completely different.
Yep.
So you never know what it's going to turn out to be.
And I'm sure some people are like, wait, but you kept mentioning that the African group of the Samothers were more giraffe and the Eurasians weren't.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem that those African more giraffe-shaped groups were the exact lineage that stayed there.
Right.
But they were getting more shaped like giraffes while in Africa.
Right. And then a Eurasian group that became very giraffe-shaped moved into Africa later on.
From one of those African groups.
Yes.
The African Samothers are the ones thought to be the ones that led toward giraffes, but it was in Asia where they became very giraffe-shaped.
And then came back.
Yes.
Weird.
Yep. Giraffes seem to have reached Africa around 7 million years ago.
Okay.
Starting in Ethiopia, across the Arabian African land bridge. It is possible that the ancestor that made it over was from one of those Asian giraffes, but some have said that it could be just directly from Bolinia, the one that gave rise to all of those Asian giraffes.
In Europe.
So it could be directly from that ancestor as well.
Okay.
The 5 species, Giraffe gracilis, pygmaea, stili, jume, and camelopardalis, today's giraffe.
Right.
These are the 5 species that definitely radiated while in Africa, but the exact relation is heavily in question. Some of these might have coexisted, some of them might have evolved in parallel, some of them might have given rise to each other.
Right.
We're not quite sure if some of these are ancestral to each other, or if some of these were around for sure at the same time. We do have evidence for at least 3 of them, Jume, gracilis, and pygmaea, that have been found occupying the same habitat and are 3 different sizes. Jume is the largest, gracilis the middle, and pygmaea the smallest.
Makes sense.
Yep. So we do have evidence of niche partitioning potentially of size with species of giraffe all at the same time.
Wow. Imagine an ecosystem with multiple different kinds of giraffe.
Yes.
Just different ways of being giraffe.
And from the sound of it, most of these would have looked very giraffe.
Mm-hmm.
Just slightly different size, slightly different. Gracilis was typically more slender-limbed. Jume was typically more heavily built. And those 2 have often been pointed to as potentially the ones that gave rise to our current species.
Camelopardalis, the modern one.
Some have pointed to Jume because it was larger, more robust, very similar to today's giraffe. While some have looked at gracilis, but gracilis is notably smaller, less heavily built than today's giraffes. Some of them being almost half the size of an adult giraffe, often compared more so to Bolinia. So a lot of people point to Jume as probably, or even potentially almost the same species, like very, very similar. Some suggesting that it's just the same species, but our giraffes just got a little bit smaller because Jume is often slightly bigger. But it's pointed out that could be the answer for gracilis, just getting bigger.
Right.
So
one of these variety of species is close to our modern giraffes.
And eventually we were left with just today's giraffe, and all those other wide varieties have gone extinct as well. We lost the Asian species. Mm-hmm. We lost everything but the okapi for the more moose-shaped and smaller species.
Right. Well, what we're left with is one representative of sort of the average ancient giraffe cousin, and then the one nonsense animal.
Yes.
That is giraffes. And
a lot of people point to habitat shifts that happened during this same time as being probably the main driver. This very much syncs up with the high browsing hypothesis for their long necks. That around this same time, we see a shift from more tropical forest, C3 plants, to a more savanna shrubland C4 biome across Africa and Asia. Mm. This coincided with the evolution of our first true giraffes, and is at the same time that we see a coastal upwelling of the Arabian Sea, which allowed migration from Europe to Asia and Africa. So everything that synced up during this time to allow giraffes into Africa also coincides with a habitat shift. This started around 8 to 10 million years ago. About 6 million years ago, the C4 plants had basically fully taken over, especially in Asia, and we see giraffes start to decline. We see species starting to go extinct around this time.
Gotcha.
Over a period of the next roughly 3 million years, the shift continues, they noted that seasonality with precipitation increases. We see like more monsoons and variability in that, as well as the ice sheets coming in, lowering the temperatures. And so in Asia, it had shifted over to C4 plants, and things had gotten colder. And by about 4 million years ago, we had lost all the Asian giraffes. But in Africa, it was still getting more arid, and the plants were still changing that way, but it was less severe. And it's thought that might be why giraffes survived in Africa. It wasn't quite as intense a change. And if indeed the neck was responding to habitat and all of these things, that they might have shifted and also been able to be successful or survive with this shifting habitat.
Right. Especially if the changes were less dramatic, less severe, that's more time to adapt to the changing habitats.
So that environmental shift is very often pointed at as just a very strong, at least correlator to the evolution we see with modern giraffes.
So it sounds like most of that ancient diversity of giraffes across the old world didn't make it to the Ice Age.
Yeah.
When the Ice Age set in, most of that was either on the way out or already gone.
Yeah, a lot of those other shapes were already extinct by the time we got tall giraffes.
Yeah.
But it seems that these tall giraffes were very much affected and syncing up with these habitat shifts that we see going into the Ice Ages. People have also noted that that habitat shift could have had other effects. I found one thing that noted acacia trees are toxic, and that toxins can have an effect on mutation rates, and that there could be a connection with evolutionary rate and them ingesting this new toxic food source.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I saw a couple of different sources that cited that as this is something to take note of. They're eating a damaging material that could be affecting, and that might be why we see such exaggerated traits, that they were evolving at a different rate than you would expect. And now that leaves us with our current world with the 1 or 4 giraffes and an okapi.
I'm going to be honest, that's a lot more of a fossil record than I expected to hear about for giraffes.
Oh, yeah.
That they're such a weird group of animals, and they really do feel like they're just out of nowhere.
Yes.
So it's very nice to have a fossil record that really does take us along sort of the journey from early sort of typical looking artiodactyl things to giraffes today.
Now, the layout that we walked through, I mostly got from one study that's from 2003, so I'm sure there's been some shifts that might have happened with some of those groups. Right.
Some of those names may have shifted.
They might have been synonymized. So I was trying to stay with genus level and compare it to what I could find, but most of that seems to still line up well with the more recent research I found. Unfortunately, that paper wasn't open access, but it was a great, they just walked you through.
Yeah.
And it was very, very fun, and I had that same reaction.
Those are nice to find.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to point out, we got to go all the way back to the Paleomericids.
Yes.
So this is that early group that we talked about with all the different weird ossicone stuff. I noticed that you had this image in your list. This is Xenocaryx, or Xenocaryx, which is one of the, like, that early group, and this one's got absolutely, utterly bizarre head ornamentation. Did you notice the species name of this animal?
I didn't, actually.
This is Xenocaryx amygdalae.
Oh, what? Oh, yeah!
It's named after Padme.
I forgot!
Because it's got that, like, T-bone shape of that back.
It's got her weird hair.
Yeah, it's got her weird hair.
I forgot. I completely missed it because I was just like, all right, taking my notes. Boom.
Yep. So this is a Paleomericid. Again, that early, that first main group we talked about, that is named after Queen Amidala.
Yeah.
Because of its weird hair. Because paleontologists are huge dorks.
Oh, that's delightful.
When was that named, actually? This is Wikipedia tells me this was named in Sanchez et al. 2015.
Yes, that was a more recent one.
Which is exactly the time period to be a researcher who grew up watching the Star Wars prequels.
Yep. Fantastic.
Very cool. One of the things that is delightful about this podcast, this is sort of a classic example of a discussion on our podcast where we take a group of animals today that is very unique and weird and fascinating, and we get to talk about what makes them weird and fascinating, and then we get to trace the history. And it is very, like, pure paleontology analysis
Yes.
of a particular group. I'm super glad we got to do a giraffes episode.
Yeah,
they're so fun.
They're so cool looking. Like, just all those different fossil groups. There's some of them, it's like, I want that as a mount in D&D or something. Like,
Yeah.
that would be awesome.
Well, and I think that an episode like this is one of those good opportunities for us to remind ourselves and our listeners that there are certain animals that we are so familiar with that we think of them as run-of-the-mill. Like, a giraffe is a giraffe. Like, there's a giraffe.
Giraffes.
You know what a giraffe is. But to take a moment and really reflect on just how weird and interesting and unique this group of animals is.
Yes.
Man, nature is cool.
Yeah.
So thanks to everyone who suggested this episode.
Yes.
That was a good call.
This was so much fun. We'll wrap up our discussion of these fascinating and wonderful animals. But before we wrap up the episode, our last thing is we have a patron question.
Hey, that's right. If I recall correctly, patrons at a certain level get to submit questions for us to answer on the podcast.
Yes, we do. So what's our question for this episode?
This episode's question comes from Frederick, who asks, is there a way to calculate how much of my biomass was in dinosaurs? How much do we know about how carbon is recycled by life? Please confirm that I am reincarnated dinosaurs and trilobites.
I love this is the dinosaur equivalent of we are made of star stuff.
Yes, we are made of dinosaur stuff.
Yes. Fantastic question. I did go looking it up. I could not find any research about it. But I did find a number of articles mentioning it. One Forbes article, which I have the link in case we want to share it, because it talks about how atoms are shared and spread across the globe, noting that in our bodies, the main elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. We're about 65% oxygen, 18.5% carbon, 9.5% hydrogen, 3.2% nitrogen, and 4% of trace materials. This is not instructions for you to try to bring back your dead mother.
You should not do that. That it's going to go wrong.
That's not what this is for. But by mass,
that's a Full Metal Alchemist reference. That one was weird enough that I didn't want to just let that sit out there. No, that's Full Metal Alchemist.
If you want to get it, go watch it. It's the best.
Brotherhood.
Yes.
What? Watch Brotherhood. Don't add us. Sorry, back to the science.
So by weight, that's our percentage breakdown. So if we were to share something with dinosaurs, it would probably be one of those.
Sure. Makes sense. Because the atoms themselves are, in theory, not being destroyed at any point. They're still floating around.
As far as we know.
Same oxygen, same hydrogen, same carbon.
Atoms are just here to stay. And we're not really getting any more or losing any here on planet Earth.
Right. Some of them will fly out to space. Like helium gets lost. Every now and then one of them might split. But that's a thing that does not typically happen under normal circumstances. And when it does, it's bad news.
Yes. They also calculated that on average, the number of each of those atoms that would be in our bodies would be, for hydrogen, 4 times 10 to the 27th, which means 4 with 27 zeros after it.
Sure.
Oxygen was 2 times 10 to the 27th. Carbon was 3 times 10 to the 26th.
Mm-hmm.
Nitrogen was 8 times 10 to the 25th. And you may notice that those don't match up with the percentages as that's because different atoms have different weights.
Right.
So the mass of one isn't going to tell you how many.
Right.
I did not find them saying carbon, but they said hydrogen and oxygen being the 2 most common, and we get most of that from breathing and drinking water.
Right.
So
that's
breathing
cycling
air,
very readily.
Those are spread very easily. So once again, if you were to get something from another organism, those 2 are our best candidates.
Right. Carbon tends to get sequestered in rocks and stuff very easily. Although that can happen to all the elements.
Yes. And that carbon can still make its way out and into others. So absolutely. But this was saying that those are the 2 they were looking at. They calculated roughly on Earth 4.1 times 10 to the 40th oxygen atoms in the atmosphere.
Sure.
And 4.5 times 10 to the 43rd oxygen in the water, and 9 times 10 to the 43rd hydrogen in the water. Right. So there's a bunch of them.
There's a lot.
Which means for each one in you of hydrogen, there's 21 quadrillion atoms of it in the atmosphere. And for every one oxygen in you, there's 26 quadrillion. Which means that if we are accumulating them randomly, if we assume we're accumulating them randomly, they did say that basically every breath you take, a year ago, within a year ago, it was breathed out by someone else.
Okay.
Like, it was in someone else's lungs, statistically speaking.
Sure. Gross.
Yep. Which means, as they put it, you have hundreds of billions of atoms that have come from someone else. Also, hundreds of billions of atoms that have come from dinosaurs and stuff.
Yeah. So you breathe the same air as dinosaurs.
Yep. They do know that the only reason this is the case is because atoms are very, very small. If they were bigger, it'd be much harder to make that assumption. Atoms are extremely tiny, and we're dealing with quadrillions of, like...
Right.
But yeah, no, absolutely, we have atoms that came from ancient organisms. I have not found anything that said mass-wise, so I can't give you a number.
Right.
But yes, for sure.
This made me think of, there was a question, so what if was a thing that XKCD did. So Randall Monroe, who does the webcomic XKCD, did these questions, these sort of scientific answers to questions. And one of the questions was, as plastic is made from oil and oil is made from dead dinosaurs, how much actual real dinosaur is there in a plastic dinosaur?
Yeah.
And you can look this up. There's a whole description of it. And what they, if I remember correctly, concluded is most oil comes from like marine algae and plankton and stuff. Oil typically is not going to be a lot of dinosaur material.
That's not where our oil reserves are coming from.
Right. Although at the end of it, it does make a point that kind of harkens to this, where they say, in a broader sense, all water in the ocean has at some point been part of a dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
When this water is used in photosynthesis, bits of it are used to build the fats and carbohydrates in the food chain, but a lot more of that water is in your body right now. In other words, your plastic toys contain a lot less dinosaur than you do.
Yep, exactly. And I found another one that was talking about, are we drinking the same water dinosaurs drink? Which the answer is probably not, because photosynthesis splits water.
Right.
So statistically, I can't remember what the number was, but like throughout the history of Earth, probably all the water has been fully recycled dozens of times through the water cycle. That maybe there's like a few molecules that have been hanging out in the Marianas Trench unaltered for a very long time, but otherwise, no, probably not. But the atoms...
Right.
The hydrogen and oxygen.
Well, and dinosaurs were around for 160 million years, and there were bajillions of them. So that's a lot of opportunity. Basically, all of those atoms had a chance.
Yes.
They all got their turn to be part of a dinosaur.
So that when we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, which is still oxygen atoms.
Mm-hmm.
So that oxygen atoms are coming in and out every time an organism breathes, going through their cellular process. And so, like, we are all breathing air that came from an organism, especially because photosynthesizers make the breathable oxygen.
Now, in a very, in the obligatory semantic sense, I ate some chicken the other day.
Yes.
And I used those atoms to construct parts of my own body.
I ate some chicken today.
Well, there you go. So you are made of dinosaur. There's a lot of dinosaur atoms inside of you.
4 tinders more dinosaur today than I was yesterday.
Thank you for that question, Frederick. It is a ridiculous and fascinating and fun question to think about.
Yes, a lot of fun. I don't know that we'd ever actually be able to calculate masses just because you're dealing with too much variability. But yes, as we are made of star stuff, we are made of all other stuff here on Earth too.
We and dinosaurs were also made of star stuff, and so were trilobites. So we share a common ancestor, a common atomic ancestor.
Yep, everything on Earth, including Earth, was made of star stuff. Yay.
This has been a great episode. This has been a ton of fun.
Yes. If you have questions about any of the things we mentioned here, as always, you can ask us or make requests to hear more about it. Check out the blog link because there's going to be lots of pictures for all of these weirdos we've been discussing this whole episode. And if you're wanting to support us, check out those links in the description.
Yeah, absolutely. Social media, Discord, Zazzle. We have merch on Zazzle if you want some merch. Audible, you can sign up for a 30-day free trial, and it supports us as well. Discord, which I may have already said, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, so reach out. Let us know what you're thinking, how you're enjoying, what you want to hear. And otherwise, check back in a fortnight.
We'll have another episode. Now I'm picturing a cartoon where the weather reporter is a giraffe.
Yes, and he's off. His head is
off
camera.
screen.
Yep.
And now we go over to the weather with Camelopardalis.
Yep.
How's the weather up there? That would be they'd say that
Yep.
every time. And then the giraffe would be like, hang on, I'm getting all the little beeps and bloops on the ossicones up there.
Well, every report would begin with a little and
and then they'd have to lean down to get into frame.
down to the mic.
Down to the mic.
That's still on their lapel.
Yes.
Or the whole report is just, well, it's really cold up here.
Yes. Atmospheric pressure. There's a cold front coming in from the west.
I'd watch it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.